Hello, boys and girls. I hope you're doing great. Hope you're having a good week and everything's going well. And hopefully, you're getting ready to start back school. If you go to Carroll County, then next Monday is when we're starting. Hopefully, anyway. I know I didn't much like school when I was growing up, but there always came a point at the end of the summer where, when I knew it was coming, I kind of got myself ready. Of course, I never had a 6 month break like we've had this time. So I'm sure that if I were you guys, I'd be ready to go back to school and see some friends and get out of the house and do some stuff. So hopefully that's coming real soon. And then once school starts in person in September 9th, that's when we're going to start our Wednesday night services back. As long as Carroll County schools are meeting in person, not virtual, then we will start back on September 9th. And we will follow that schedule as long as Carroll County schools are in person. We will keep meeting on Wednesday nights. We made some changes this year to kind of try to help keep everybody as safe as possible. We will not be running the bus, at least for right now. And so if you're coming on Wednesday night, you have to have somebody to pick you up and drop you off. I know that doesn't help a lot of people, but we can't have the bus running full and people on top of each other. And so as of right now, the plan is September 9th, as long as Carroll County schools are meeting in person, we're going to have our first Wednesday night service, but we're not running the bus. We will still have the food and still do everything else. We can't go pick people up and stuff like that. All right, so on to our lesson for this week. We've been going through Acts, going in order what happened after Jesus rose and went back to heaven. We're in Acts chapter 18. And so for a long time, the last several chapters, we've been talking about Paul. Paul has become a great leader of the church. He's a missionary. He's going out and starting churches. He's going all over the Roman world. And in many cases, he's the first person to talk about Jesus in these places. And so he goes and he's starting churches and he's creating disciples and he's spending time there. But there's a cycle that we see in the stories of Paul. First of all, he goes to the Jewish community first. And then when they reject him or the message, he goes to the Gentile community. So there's the Jews and then there's the Gentiles. And then while he's talking to the Gentiles, the cycle is that many believe. And then it depends on the city and the time. But after a while, after some time, there's people get stirred up. They don't like what Paul's saying, or they don't want to change, or they're losing business because people are converting to Christianity. And so they get mad, they stir people up, and then they do different things to try to make Paul stop teaching. He's been beaten, he's been stoned, he's been run out of town, he's been put in jail, all different kinds of things. And so that's the cycle that we've been reading about. And we've talked about how Paul had great faith and knew what he was doing was extremely important, and that he didn't give up, he didn't quit, no matter how hard it got. So chapter 18 starts out pretty much the same way. Paul's in a town called Corinth, and it's a pretty important place because later on in his life, Paul writes 2 letters to the Corinthians, which are the people at Corinth. And they're in the New Testament. Those are 2 letters that are very important in the Bible that people still read and talk about and teach on. So the church at Corinth is an important one in the history of the church and what Paul did. So, Paul is leaving Athens and he goes to Corinth. He meets two new friends named Aquila and Priscilla. They're believers, and they travel around with Paul some, but they become big friends and important to his ministry. But when he gets to Corinth, it says that so Paul met Priscilla and Aquila, and they were tent makers. That was their job. They made tents for whatever reason people needed tents to travel with, or to live in, or to have a shade like we would use a big tent for now, or whatever. And it also tells us that Paul himself was a tent maker. So there's you a little trivia. If anybody ever asks you what was Paul's job, he was a tent maker. That was a profession that he could fall back on. And so it says that while he's here in Corinth, he stays with Priscilla and Aquila, and he helps them make tents for a while. And they're selling them, and so he's making money. It's a way for him to make money. While he's teaching, he goes to the synagogue first, which is the Jewish church. That's the same thing that he does in every city. He goes there and is teaching, and it's going smooth for a while. People are listening. People are hearing the word. They're converting. They're believing. It says that good things are happening. Silas and Timothy join him from where he had left them in Macedonia. We read about them in the last chapter. They're Paul's traveling companions, and they're his helpers, and he had left them to keep teaching while he had to kind of flee, and then they were supposed to join him later. And so they join him here in Corinth. When they got there, it says that Paul devoted himself exclusively to preaching, which means that he stopped working on the side making tents, and that every day he was preaching and teaching and persuading people. So then the same cycle starts to reoccur. So things are going good. Paul's teaching. He's converting people. He hasn't had a reason to leave the synagogue yet. They're still inviting him back, and he's getting to talk. And even though there's probably some argument, it's a healthy argument, and Paul's able to do good. But then it says, but when the Jews opposed Paul and became abusive, it doesn't talk about the specific abuse, but it says when they became abusive, he shook out his clothes in protest and said, "Your blood is on your hands. I'm clear of my responsibility." So they've got to the point where they don't want to hear Paul anymore, and they run him out. And he says, "Look, that's fine. I'm not going to try to convince you or force you to do something. This is your choice." And then it says that Paul went next door. He left the synagogue and went next door to a guy's house who was a believer. And he started teaching in this guy's house to the Gentiles, right next door to the Jewish church. And so this guy believed, his whole family believed. He invited Paul there. Paul is there teaching. So in verse 9 of Acts chapter 18, which is where we're reading, it says, "One night the Lord spoke to Paul in a vision." So normally in our cycle of Paul, when trouble starts to arise and stuff, it doesn't stop until he leaves. So we're kind of at that point in our cycle where trouble has come up and he's still there teaching, but normally trouble keeps coming up and he has to leave. So it says that one night the Lord spoke to the Lord and to Paul in a vision. Do not be afraid. Keep on speaking. Do not be silent. For I am with you, and no one is going to attack and harm you, because I have many people in this city. Which is good, and it's good news from the Lord, and it's encouraging. Obviously, Paul has gone through this cycle before, and I'm sure, nobody wants to be beaten or stoned or put in jail or whatever. Okay? Now, Paul went through those things and faced them and did them, and he didn't turn away from them because of the Lord, and he wasn't scared, but he didn't want it to happen. It doesn't feel good to get beaten, and so that's encouraging to Paul. And so it says that Paul stayed for 1.5 years teaching them the Word of God. Now, I find that very encouraging. Corinth is a pretty big city, and people are very receptive to the word there. And this is the longest so far that we know Paul has stayed in one place. Now, there's some times where it says that he stayed for a while, but we don't know how long that is. This is the longest that we know of that he's stayed in one place. 1.5 years in one place teaching the word every day to anybody who would listen. It goes on to tell us, never mind. So, Paul's teaching, the church is growing, the numbers are growing daily. He has a protection there, and the Lord has said, I'm going to protect you, nothing's going to harm you here. Keep on keeping on. Keep on teaching, keep on spreading the gospel. And that's what he does. And so the church experiences some growth there. For the time being, at least, we see the cycle kind of broken, where Paul runs into opposition and has to leave for whatever reason. Because it goes on to tell us there was a little bit of opposition that came up. Kind of the same thing. Some people got upset, and they dragged Paul into basically like a little court. And it says, they charged him with persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. So they were upset. And it says just as Paul was about to speak to defend himself, which is normal. That's what he would have normally done. The guy who they drug him in front of wouldn't let Paul speak, and he interrupted him. He said, "This is silly. This guy hasn't done anything wrong. Get him out of here. I don't want to talk to him. I don't want to hear from him. He hasn't done anything wrong." So, we're seeing a little bit of that pattern. The opposition, they're coming against Paul. And normally, what we've seen before is these little judges or rulers or whoever they are will hear out the trial and then, whatever. But this guy, he wouldn't even let Paul speak. He wouldn't let them speak. He said, "This is silly. Get out of here. Y'all are wasting my time. You're wasting his time. You're wasting your time. He hasn't done anything wrong. You can't even bring real charges against him. Get out." So these people were upset. They did what they were told, but then they turned on another man who was the ruler of the synagogue, the Jewish church, and they beat him up in front of this little judge guy, and the judge guy didn't care. So this crowd was all worked up, and they needed somebody to blame. And when they couldn't do it to Paul, they turned on one of their own guys and beat him up, and nobody said or did anything because it was silly, and they were just being crazy. So after that, Paul has been there. He's teaching. He's still got the safety. He didn't have to go to trial. He didn't have to give a defense. He didn't have to he wasn't forced to leave. He didn't experience any kind of beating or stoning or flogging or anything like that. So it says that Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left. He left on his own. And that's the thing. That's what Paul did. He was going around starting churches, and he still was doing that. So he had the opportunity to stay there and do good, and good things happen in Corinth. And then he chose to go to the next place in his journey, not under pressure, not under persecution, not being forced to. And, he's able to travel freely. He's nobody's in pursuit of him. Nobody's like it's a different scenario than what we've read before. And so the next place that Paul is headed to is he sailed for Syria. Priscilla and Aquila, his new friends, come with him. I'm sure Timothy and Silas come with him, and maybe some other people are coming with him too. And it's important, these people that follow him, when they get to new places, he kind of leaves them. Like he's been able to sit in one place long enough to train some disciples. And so that's what Priscilla and Aquila are. They're disciples now. And so when they get to this next place, they stay there and teach the church and strengthen the church. And Paul's able to go to the next city. And that's why he left Timothy and Silas in Macedonia last week. Because Paul's one person. And he does great things, but there are other people who can help him. And so more can get done because more people are able to do the work instead of just one person. So he's trained up other leaders, and that when they go from place to place, he'll leave somebody to kind of get things started and to teach them and to be with them while he goes on to the next place. It's really cool how that happens, and it's still a model that missionaries use today. So if somebody goes somewhere and starts up a church, they start immediately trying to train leaders from that area so that they can go out into other places into that country, or when the missionaries leave, they're not taking everything with them, that they can leave some people there in charge who know what's going on and know the word and things like that. So they leave Priscilla. He leaves Priscilla and Aquila. He leaves them in Ephesus. Ephesus is another important church because Paul writes letters to them too that we still read about in the book of Ephesians. That's to the church at Ephesus. Paul only stays for a short time, but he promises to come back. Then, while Paul leaves them, a new person kind of comes on the scene there in Ephesus. His name is Apollos. Now, Apollos is doing the same thing Paul is doing, but he doesn't know about Jesus and the resurrection. He's still teaching about before Jesus with John the Baptist and repentance and stuff like that. And so Priscilla and Aquila, that Paul left in Ephesus, bring him in and they teach him about Jesus. And Apollos is doing good. He's doing good things. He's doing good works. And so he's encouraged to keep teaching, and they send him out because he's doing the same thing that Paul is, and he's starting churches. He just didn't know the full story, and yet he was starting churches and converting people. And so there we can see the importance of someone like Priscilla and Aquila in a place. They were able to teach him more and send him out. And we know that Apollos does good work and that he converts many people. And so it's an amazing thing that they were there and able to help him. So that's pretty much chapter 18. It's a little different than what we've been reading, a little bit more upbeat and cheerful. A lot of good things are happening in the chapter. Paul's able to spend a large amount of time without persecution and is able to teach disciples and grow the church. And these disciples are important keeping the church going or starting it, or we would call them church plants, like starting new churches on their own. So next week in chapter 19, it's another good chapter, good things happening. Paul, it seems, has entered a peaceful phase of his ministry, which is good, because it hasn't been peaceful so far. I hope you guys enjoyed today's story. If you have any questions or anything, let us know. Remember, September 9th, as long as schools are in person, we're going to start back up our Wednesday night services. Hope you guys have a good week, and can't wait to see you in person. And until we do, though, we love you and we care for you, and we'll see you on the next video.